Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining us for our ninth event of MICCA Meeting the Candidates Series virtual town hall. And tonight we have the honor to have the former police chief, the gubernatorial candidate for the Republican Party, Chief Craig, to join us. Chief Craig has served in Los Angeles. He was a Detroit native, and he was also police chief for Portland, Oregon, Cincinnati, Ohio, and it became, and it became police chief of Detroit in 2013. So I guess you're rooting for Bengals this weekend, right? Yeah, there you go. So before we get started, let me just say a few words about us. MICCA, or Michigan Conservative Chinese Americans, is the only conservative-leaning organization representing Chinese American community in Michigan. It was founded in 2018, and this organization has been actively involved in the election process by supporting Republican candidates. Chinese Americans in Michigan is one of the largest immigrant community, and MICCA's goal is to improve the voting rate among the Chinese Americans in Michigan and promote awareness that a GOP platform is highly consistent with the value with the vast majority of Chinese Americans who experienced disasters of socialism before we came to this great country. MICCA in the past few years has organized volunteer activities from precinct delegate recruiting, phone banking, door knocking, and poll challenging watching. We also organized a couple of fundraiser events to support Republican gubernatorial candidate Bill Schuette in 2018 after the primary election. So to prepare for the 2022 midterm election, MICCA initiated Meeting Candidates virtual Zoom series with the purpose of introducing Republican statewide candidates to our community, so the voters in a primary or the state convention, including the endorsement convention in April and the state convention in August, to be better informed about who they're going to vote for and to represent Republicans and to take the state back. All right. So with that, I will have Chief Craig. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me just start, Gary, by saying I'm honored, humbled to be here to speak to your organization. And a little bit about my background, I'll talk a little bit, but let me first start out by saying happy year of the tiger.
Right.
You know, the Zoom thing, I just can't see folks. I love looking at people and engaging, but certainly very excited, and happy year of the tiger is important to me. But a little bit about me, as you pointed out, Gary. Certainly I've been a public servant, and I make a distinction between public servant, not a political servant. I have never been a politician. I've served people, in fact, 44 years, starting in Detroit, Michigan, as a 19-year-old who joined the Detroit Police Department. And then through unfortunate circumstances, Detroit laid off 1,500 police officers. So I had to make a decision, and I ended up moving on to Los Angeles, California, where I spent the lion's share of my professional career. 28 years, LAPD. I went through Rodney King. Rodney King was a very critical incident in our profession. For those who may not know, that's when Rodney King was stopped by a Los Angeles police officer. He was beaten. There certainly was a trial, and it was then that riots erupted in Los Angeles. I was a sergeant then, but it was certainly a devastating time in Los Angeles. But I learned a lot, and I continued to move up the ranks. And as Gary pointed out, I became chief of police. That was a goal I had set. I ended up becoming the chief of police, not of Portland, Oregon. I can talk a little bit about that, but actually Portland, Maine. I don't know how many of you know about Maine, because when I applied for Maine coming out of LA, I had never even visited the state of Maine. In fact, a kind of an interesting point, I was a finalist for chief of police in the city of Boston, Massachusetts, and Tucson, Arizona, but I ended up going to Portland, Maine. I didn't know why, but it became clear. So I ended up being the first African-American chief in the entire state of Maine. And I said, why am I here? One of the notable points about Portland had the third largest African immigrant population in the United States, only exceeded by Minneapolis, Columbus, and in Portland, Maine. But what was interesting when I came in, the African immigrants and local government, a lot of friction. Somali and Sudanese immigrants had converged in Maine. They didn't trust the government. In fact, Somali and Sudanese didn't get along. So as chief of police, I had to come in and bring folks together. And so as I talk about my background, these are the things that resonate with why we need to change in the state. The state's broken, the administration's broken. Frankly, the nation's broken. It's very partisan, very divided. But one thing I learned early on, having served as chief, and in fact, I served as chief of police in 3 different cities over 12 years. And so I learned early on, not just as chief, but during my career, the importance of bringing people to the table that, frankly, you may not agree with. They may not like you, but what's most important is the people you serve. And that's why when I started this conversation, I talked about being a public servant, not a political servant, because I really firmly believe in 44 years I served people. And as your governor, I'm going to serve people. So I served in Portland for a couple of years. We were able to bridge the gap with the African immigrant community, so much so, because I really felt that if we hadn't addressed the issue, there would have been problems in Portland, Maine. And so from Portland, I get a call to go to Cincinnati. Now, my ultimate goal was to become a chief of a major city. And Portland, while it was the largest city in the state of Maine, it wasn't considered a major city. Cincinnati was. And what attracted me to Cincinnati, it was a city that had gone through racial strife. In fact, Cincinnati had civil unrest in the early 2000s. The Cincinnati Police Department had been involved in 14 African-American men being shot by Cincinnati police. From that, they had civil unrest. They went under federal oversight, a federal consent decree. And so I was appointed after all that was over. And so like in Portland, I was the first African-American chief to serve as the chief of Cincinnati. They had never had an outsider in Cincinnati, but Cincinnati still had a lot of wounds because of the relationship. So I was able to come in, build relationships, heal the community, sit down with folks. Once again, they didn't necessarily trust the police, but we were able to bridge the gap, and we were able to do some wonderful things in the community. And so I was there for 2 years in Portland. And you might be wondering, say, wait a minute, can you keep a job? You were a police chief in Portland for 2 years, police chief in Cincinnati for 2 years. And the only reason why I left Cincinnati, and I love the city, it was a great city. In fact, people oftentimes ask me and say, well, has you ever considered being a politician? Never. I love being a police officer, serving people. But when Detroit knocked on the door, as you may know, many of you may know, in 2013, Detroit was placed under emergency management. They were facing bankruptcy. They had taken power from city council and the mayor's office and gave it to an emergency manager. So it was very controversial here in the city of Detroit. But they wanted a police chief that could come in and fix all the things that were not working real well for the city in terms of public safety. And so I got a phone call from Governor Snyder's administration, who was the governor at the time. And I said, I get to go home. I started in Detroit. I can finish in Detroit. And so, but what was most interesting when I was looking at coming home to Detroit, Cincinnati, some of you may know that is home of a lot of major businesses. Procter & Gamble, certainly one of the biggest corporations in our country, was headquartered in Cincinnati. American Financial, Dan Gilbert built a casino. And when they heard I was leaving Cincinnati to go to Detroit, they called for a meeting with me. And they said, look, we don't want you to leave. We think the job you did here as police chief was phenomenal. We want you to be our mayor, and we want to support you financially. And while I was humbled by that request, I said, I have an opportunity to go home. And so I went home, certainly worked with Kevin Orr, who was the emergency manager here in Detroit in 2013. As you know, Detroit went through bankruptcy. But what's most notable, the city was broken, the police department was broken. Like right now, our state is broken. The administration's broken. And so I'm not a leader that has learned this from a book. I'm a leader who understands crisis management and crisis leadership, not just because I came to Detroit, but what I've done over 44 years. So I ended up returning to Detroit. I met with police officers who were demoralized, demonized. You know, you hear a lot of that now, given this environment of defund the police. The Detroit police officers were defunded, and the morale was at the bottom. So I knew coming in, it was going to be a heavy lift. I knew it. And so I ended up meeting with police officers, because I've always believed as a leader, if you want to know what's going on, and many of you who might run businesses, you know, first and foremost, talk to the folks who do the work. And I did that. And in doing so, I learned a lot about the organization, but I also knew that Detroit residents, but not just Detroit residents, people in Metro Detroit had no confidence in this police department. So I had a heavy lift, and the end result was we turned the police department around. I was able to raise the morale of the men and women of the police department, the morale of the people who lived in Detroit, people who worked in Detroit. Because let me just say, some of you may remember when I got here, response times to emergency calls, 1 hour. Murders that were committed in Detroit, only 11% were being solved. And so what do you think about the families that lost loved ones? They had no confidence. And so it was a heavy lift, but some of you who are on the call today may be familiar with the green light that's in Detroit. That was something I came up with to really address some of the violent crime in locations across our city, gas stations, liquor stores that were hotbeds of criminal activity. We turned it around. I was able to build a very effective team. And so when I talk about building an effective team, when we look at what's going on in Lansing right now, I think some of us can say it's broken. There have been some talented people that have come into Lansing, but they've left. I know some of them. Some of them worked in Detroit with me when I was chief of police. So first and foremost, when people ask me, so what are you going to do as governor? I'm going to build a team. This is what I understand how to do. A team that respects people who live in our state. This is not about the governor. This is not about people who lead departments. It's about the people of Michigan. Just like when I was chief of police, it wasn't about me as a chief. It was about people living in Detroit who have been underserved for too long. And so I look back, serving 8 years as a chief of police. We did wonderful, effective work in the city. But a lot of people, as I've traversed the state, one of the things they always want to ask me, they say, well, Chief, why didn't Detroit burn in 2020 like so many cities? I know when Gary was doing the intro, he said, well, he's the chief of Portland, Oregon. No, not Portland, Oregon. As you know, Portland, Oregon was home of rioting, looting. In fact, they set up the infamous chop zone where protesters took over 6 city blocks, kicked police officers out of their police station, and took the city over, basically. And the mayor did nothing. The police chief did nothing. They said, summer of love. And so I watched this with intensity. I watched what happened in my old home of LA. I watched Chicago, Philadelphia, cities that were on fire. Even in our state here in Michigan, city of Grand Rapids saw looting. Lansing, Kalamazoo, I think, was another city. And so, but not Detroit. And so most times I get asked, why not Detroit? You know, Detroit had a major civil unrest in 1967. The city burned. The city really did change after that. And frankly, there's evidence that is still recovering from that. However, in 2020, we didn't burn. One of the things I did, and I think it's important to share, when I became chief in 2013, I met with a lot of activists here in the city of Detroit. And candidly, some of these folks didn't care much for me. I didn't care much for them. They didn't like the police. But more important than that, I knew it was critical that I sit down and that we find solutions that would benefit Detroit, not the chief of police, me, not the police department, but what's in the best interest of Detroit. And I only bring that up because that's what's missing today. You know, as a nation, as a state, we've become so partisan. And what I've done is I've understood that you have to get in rooms with people that you're not necessarily going to agree with, but you do it because one, it's the right thing to do. And secondly, it's in the best interest of the people we serve. And that's what I offer to you as your next governor. And so those same activists I met with, when we were in the midst of 2020, when cities were burning, and while absolutely I took a firm stand that we weren't going to tolerate it, I called on those same activists that I built relationships with. And I said, look, I need you to stand with us, be with us, because there's outside people trying to promote violence in our city. And I need you to stand with us. And they did it. And so it was a very dynamic situation. And yes, as the leader of the police department, I had zero tolerance for criminal behavior. I wasn't gonna let anybody burn our city, burn businesses, loot businesses, and attack our police officers. That was non-negotiable. And to the activists that joined us, they recognized that there were outsiders in the city of Detroit that says, not here, not now. And so when you look at the total picture, we did win. We came out in a positive way. And so a lot of times people say, well, 2020 was special for Detroit. How did you make a decision to even consider running for governor. And so when I see what's going on in our country today, when I see what's going on in our state, the division, the fact that Democrat Party today is moving very far to the left, socialism, government overreach. That's not who I am. I support freedom. And I know all of you support freedom. I'm a fighter. I'm unapologetic. I've taken stands that sometimes were not always politically correct, certainly not in a city like Detroit. The funny thing about it, as a police chief, I served and led as a police professional. Nobody ever asked me, well, are you Republican? Are you Democrat? What are you? Nobody ever asked me. I just went about the business of serving people. And that's what I did. And I know at the appropriate time, we're going to have questions, but I want to talk a little bit about why I became a Republican, because I think it's important for you to know. As a police officer for 44 years, police officers tend to be conservative. I was conservative. My parents, my late mother, who was a poll worker for many years, worked in election polls, volunteered, was a conservative. My dad, a conservative. He served in the U.S. Army. He was a military police officer. He raised myself and my siblings as conservatives, but we were Democrats. When you're African American and you grew up in Detroit, you're a Democrat. And so sometimes I tell folks that I didn't leave the Democrat Party. The Democrat Party left me. But more importantly, I had an opportunity to live in different cities, from Los Angeles, Portland, Maine, Cincinnati, and been back home to Detroit. My view of the world was very different, of our nation. So of course I transitioned. As a conservative, a proud conservative, I transitioned to becoming a Republican. I'm unapologetic about it. And I'm excited because I think many of you who are part of the Conservative Party understand what freedom looks like. You embrace it. You understand what government overreach looks like. I don't support that. And so I'm going to go into some specific areas that I'm most passionate about. And then I certainly welcome questions. So I talk a lot about leadership. The current governor said she's going to fix the roads. That hasn't happened. And candidly, you can't fix anything if you don't have the right people in your administration carrying out the day-to-day business. The one thing I've learned in Detroit, because when I came into the Detroit Police Department, I had a dysfunctional leadership team, and I don't want to even use the word leadership, management team. I changed it. So here's the beauty of that management team. Some have gone on to become chiefs of police in other cities. And why it's important to share that with you, when you build an effective team, other cities look at the team and they say, I want what you want. I want what you have. So by example, one of the members of my team went on to become the first female chief, outside chief of the Dallas, Texas Police Department. Recently, two of the members of our department that I mentored are now running Columbus, Ohio. The chief and the second in command are from Detroit Police. Those of you who may be familiar with the city of Southfield, that chief is from Detroit. And then there's a host of other folks that have gone in the private sector. My former chief of staff in Detroit is now running all of security for Dan Gilbert. that's a testimonial relative to building an effective team. People want what Detroit had. And so I'm humbled and excited that these folks have moved on. The same thing I did for this department, other departments, I will do for the state. Let's face it, there's been mismanagement. Let's talk about the unemployment debacle, with $8.4 billion mismanaged, given out, no excuse. Let's talk about COVID in senior or long-term care facilities. Seniors, 40% undercounted. And so when you look at those issues, as a police chief, I couldn't just say, well, this individual who ran the unemployment, he has resigned, and then you give him $84,000 severance, and the people of Michigan don't know the full story. I would never have done that as a Detroit police chief, because as Michiganders, you deserve and expect to know what happened. Look, let's face it, things do happen, mistakes happen, and when they happen, all you expect is the people that you put in office tell the truth, own it, and say what happened. But more importantly, what am I going to do so it doesn't reoccur? $8.4 billion. And all you can say is, we're going to try to recoup that. Let's talk about Ford Motor Company. You know, one of the things as your next governor, we know in our state, the big three industries are manufacturing, agriculture, and tourism. The underpinning of our manufacturing industry is what? Automobiles. Automobiles right here in Michigan. Ford Motor Company made a decision to do what? They moved their electric vehicle operations to Kentucky and Tennessee. And the administration, their only response was, we didn't know. That's not acceptable. What is acceptable is we build relationships with people that can draw and keep businesses here in our state, particularly the automobile industry. We didn't know. And so this is what's interesting. As a police chief and also the deputy mayor of the city of Detroit, Mayor Duggan vigorously and relentlessly pursued FCA, now Stellantis, to build a new plant in the city of Detroit. He did that. He did it. First time in 30 years, they built a new automobile plant in the city of Detroit, on the east side of Detroit, to build the new Jeep Wagoneer. The mayor of Detroit. How come the governor couldn't see the sense of urgency in finding a way of keeping Ford Motor Company here for their EV operations? Not acceptable. So my platform is as follows. Leadership's important, certainly to build an effective team to get the work done that you expect me as your governor to get done. Secondly, public safety. Now, of course, serving for 44 years, it is not acceptable that what we see in many of our major cities and here in the state of Michigan, that we have woke prosecutors, soft on crime prosecutors, judges who will bail out these violent, predatory criminals. So what we see today in our state and in other places, we're making victims out of criminals. That's not who I am. I will hold reckless socialist prosecutors accountable, judges accountable. I will use my bully pulpit, and I will use the authority as the governor to make sure that they're being held accountable. Because when I last looked, prosecutors don't make laws. We're a prosecutor right now, and whoever put the thumbs up, thank you for that. We have prosecutors right now who will no longer charge felony firearm in Ingham County, the same county that our current governor was briefly the prosecutor, but has said nothing. That doesn't work for Michigan. It certainly doesn't work for me. So public safety. The other thing I'm going to tackle, and it's dismissed, mental illness. We have got to fix the care we give to the mentally ill. Here's what I know. In many of our prisons, our jails, I know before the late Benny Napoleon was running the Wayne County Jail, he told me 70 to 80% of his inmate population was suffering from mental illness. Okay, so the problem is the jail is not the place where you give that kind of treatment. So public safety. Second is education. As a state, we're failing miserably. We have a high illiteracy rate. So when I rolled out my education plan, I had a great opportunity to visit a couple of charter schools. I started in Detroit, went to Flint, ended in Lansing. So in Detroit public schools, 8% of children, by the time they reach the third grade, can read. 8%. My next stop was Flint. 10%, by the time they reach the third grade, could read. And then on to Lansing, Michigan, 25% can read by the time they're in third grade. So of course, our governor will say, well, it's the pandemic. Florida kept their schools open. Arizona didn't have that issue. And oh, by the way, this illiteracy rate started before the pandemic. They're more concerned about ensuring that critical race theory is taught in our schools. You know, that's where persons of color are victims. And if you're white, you're an oppressor. This indoctrination has no place in our schools. Let me just say, as an African-American man who grew up in Detroit, I have never been a victim for anyone. And it's shameful that we are indoctrinating the future of our state in that fashion. So guess what? Not on my watch. As your governor, illiteracy, children are going to be able to read because we know they need to learn to read so they can read to learn. Critically important. And lastly, and as many of you understand, economic development. Oh my goodness, I already talked about Ford Motor Company leaving. And when we think about our infrastructure, we think about our roads, part of the reason why Ford didn't give us the nod, one, because honestly, the administration didn't have the kind of relationship that we have ongoing conversations. Look, this is home of the American automobile industry. I will, as your governor, defend those three industries: manufacturing, tourism, and agriculture. I didn't realize this until I got on this campaign trail, that Michigan's agriculture industry is number 2 in the country. Number 2, only exceeded by the state of California, where I spent 30 years. I met with the Farm Bureau and they told me, they said, Chief, the governor won't even talk to us. And you know why? Because they supported her Republican opponent when she was running. Well, let me just say, I don't care who supports me. Again, as I said earlier, this is about the business of Michigan. I don't really care who supports me. It's bigger than me. It's about our state. And so that's what I give you. And as I close, and I'm excited about taking questions. I know Adam Wright, my campaign manager, who he just took over recently. I'm excited about his leadership and what he brings. You may have heard that I've made some administrative changes in the campaign. Let me tell you some great news. Many of you I know followed about the great election recently in Virginia with Governor Youngkin, who I've had a chance to meet. And the good news is his consultant team is now Chief James Craig for Governor of Michigan's team. They're here, they're on the ground. We've had several great meetings. They understand the importance of Michigan. They understand the importance of this campaign. And they said to me when we called, they said, Chief, we're excited about you. And I said, wow, I mean, I was humbled by that. One, I've never been a candidate. I call myself a blue collar candidate because I'm not a self-funder. I came up from humble beginnings. I worked on the line in an assembly plant. I went to engineering school from Cass Tech, a product of public school here in Detroit. But I made the right decision to be a public servant as a police officer. So that said, I'm excited about Jeff Rowe, who is the lead principal who ran Governor Youngkin's team out in Virginia. And lastly, I'll close on this. I'm not big on polls. One, I'm not a pollster. However, I mean, so the recent polls that have come out, some have said I'm in a dead heat with the incumbent, Gretchen Whitmer. Some have said I was a little bit behind Whitmer. All the polls said I'm ahead of all of the other Republican candidates. We have now 2 self-funders in the campaign. And people ask me, so what do you think about it? I don't really care. The voters are going to vote for who they think can get the job done. And so, but here's one thing that stood out. And Adam, if I left something, please feel free to chime in. What I was most encouraged by is the fact that 17% of independents in Michigan, based on the poll, put me ahead of Whitmer by 17%. So when I hear that, I get excited because I said, this is an opportunity. As we know, the state of Michigan is kind of purplish. You got Democrats, you got Republicans, and you got a big body of independents who really want to support a candidate who will get the job done. And so with that, I don't know, Adam, as I close out before taking questions, was it anything I left out concerning polls or the future of where we at?
Chief, you did a really good job. I think the one thing that I would point out, which is really big in general elections, is the chief is very, very popular and has great name ID in the Detroit metro area. And as you probably know, when you're in a general election, Republicans don't tend to normally do so well in the Detroit metropolitan area. And so his candidacy really provides an opportunity and really places him as the only candidate that can really face off and defeat the incumbent governor. Everyone else has to catch up to where Chief currently is because of the work that he's done as the police chief for 8 years and his experience here in Michigan. So I think that's just one thing I think that we could add that demonstrates his strength as a general election candidate.
Adam, I appreciate that. I think that really ties it up real nice. So Gary, once again, I appreciate the invitation. I'm happy to be here. and talk to your constituents, conservative Chinese Americans, excited, certainly asking for your support. And so with that, I'll take any questions you might have.
Sure. Thank you very much, Chief. Yeah, so first, just a couple of housekeeping notes. If you have any questions, please use the, on the Zoom screen at the bottom, there's a kind of reactions. You can click on the raise hand. This means you have a question. I see a few already. Please raise your hand, and then I will ask you to unmute, and then you can ask a question. All right. So yeah, we're waiting for that. And Chief, really thank you so much, and for what you have done. Not just being a public servant, really helped Detroit to weather the storm in 2020. A side note: I was traveling the last few weeks, and I tell people I came from Detroit metro area. They said, "Oh, Detroit." So what? Oh, Detroit. Do you know that in 2020, Detroit is one of the few major cities that did not get burned and looted. So thanks to you, Chief Craig. I really appreciate
you so much,
running for the governor, and it gave us a great opportunity to take our state back. So that being said, I will take questions here. I will ask people to unmute themselves and with the raise a hand, and we'll go from there.
A lot of hands up, Gary. A lot of hands up.
Yeah, yeah, I know. Okay, Mike, you go.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Chief James. We're very excited as well.
Thank you.
You touched based on quite a few very important issues. You mentioned about the road. So Whitmer promised to fix the road, but almost 4 years have passed by. Last time I checked, Michigan still ranked top 10 worst road around in the country.
Yes.
And also I've noticed that the problems are lingering, like a wasteful patching and the cracks on the newly constructed roads start showing the problems and all that. And you mentioned about the effectiveness of a team you build around you to tackle on the issues. What I'd like to understand, want to know is, if you could elaborate a little bit more as the governor, what would you do in addition to the effective, team you build and capable people around you? What would be the major policy or solutions that you would put in place to address this a very stubborn issue for a long time? Obviously, Whitmer, broke her promise.
Well, and the roads are important. Clean water is important. Let's face it, this administration, I didn't mention it, and we talk about our infrastructure, Benton Harbor, is subject to dirty water. And it was only until somebody reached out to the EPA that there was a heightened response. We need to drive a rapid response team, because it's not just going to be Benton Harbor and Flint. I suspect that because of our aging infrastructure with pipes, this is going to continue, but we have to have a plan in place. And this is why I put so much emphasis on leadership, building an effective team. The roads are not fixed. And in part, the reason why Ford Motor Company went to Tennessee and Kentucky, because one of the issues that I learned is that when it comes to their roads, I think it was some engineering, NSAD or whatever it's called, ranked their roads in the top 10. And they ranked Michigan as a D. So when I talk about education, we're failing. Our roads, we're failing. I don't have all the answers, but I will tell you that what I did as a police chief, what I will do as a governor, I'm going to surround myself with the right folks. I'm going to listen to people, because part of the problem, even when you look at the pandemic and when unilateral decisions were made that were unfriendly, and I got to believe that Ford Motor Company, major corporation, when you create an unfriendly business environment, people don't want to be here. And so part of what we need to do going forward, we got to fix this education thing. That's critical. 2, we got to create friendly environments. But the only way we can do that is that the CEO of the state has to sit down with major corporations and say, how can I help you? And make it happen. And the things you can't do, because we have great post-educational institutions here, Michigan State, U of M, these folks are leaving. This young talent is leaving. What are we doing to incentivize businesses to come here and to stay here? Nothing. Here's the other thing. When you talk about attracting businesses and you talk about infrastructure, I can talk all day about water, but you know, we're not the most friendly place when it even comes to electricity. It's very high. We have to become competitive with the top 10 states. I want us to be in the top 10. And there's certain aspects of what defines a top 10 state, and education's right there, developing talent, incentivizing and making sure businesses stay here and attracting other businesses. We can be that. And I know we can.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, thank you. Next one, question from Hongwei.
Good evening, Chief. Thank you so much for spending time with us. We're very excited that you're going to be running for the governor.
Well, thank you.
We look forward to see you, leading the race. I do have a quick question to your home gain. And basically, you touched upon those rogue prosecutors that was, making the situations in Chicago, Philadelphia, Los Angeles a lot worse in comparison to a few years back. And another phenomenon is defunding the police department. So to those two issues, I understand that you're very experienced in that. Just want to get a little bit more details as to what type of influence will governor have in terms of doing those type of thing and restore the confidence, from a general public perspective to police department and prosecutor role in Michigan. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that as to what type of approach you're going to take?
I'd be happy to, and thank you for your question. First of all, the number one priority of the governor, the president, is public safety. Number one. I know it, I respect it. And so as governor, there's a couple of things that come to mind. First of all, the governor has a bully pulpit to make sure that these socialist, rogue, woke prosecutors are called out. That also includes judges. You may or may not know, even as chief of police, where I had no authority over judges, but there was a judge who let out a suspect who was charged with second-degree murder, who had killed a sergeant with the Detroit Police Department, killed her, let her out, didn't have the common decency to explain to the family, but he felt what he was doing was being compassionate. I called him a coward. And so you might think, well, what does name calling have to do with it? You have to use the bully pulpit at times to certainly put the community on notice. Look at what's going on. This is not acceptable. Why are we voting for politicians who don't have our best interests in mind? That's number one. But secondly, as the governor, I know that I would have the authority that if a person engaged in gross neglect of duty, providing under Michigan state law If it came to my attention and based on the evidence, I could take action against a rogue prosecutor. Let's face it, police officers, police departments don't write laws. Prosecutors don't write laws. Judges don't write laws. Those who are elected in the Senate, representatives in the state, they make the laws. And you can disagree with the law. If you disagree with the law, then run for state Senate. But you don't get to, as a district attorney, and I use Ingham County because this prosecutor has made a statement, I will no longer prosecute anyone charged with felony firearm because it puts too many minorities in jail. Well, Miss Prosecutor, you don't write the laws. You don't. You get to enforce. Prosecutors are actually chief enforcement officers of their county. So what gives you the right to not enforce the laws you were elected to abide by? Now, there is something called prosecutorial discretion. I get it. There are certain times that there may be a case brought to a prosecutor that doesn't pass muster, and they can decide, I'm not going to prosecute. But when you make a blatant statement that you will no longer charge, so as your governor, my commitment is I will hold that prosecutor accountable within the confines of what I can do within my authority. I can do it, I will do it, and I will do it unapologetically and courageously.
Bravo.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you.
Next question, I think, is from Rui Hua.
Yeah.
Go
Hi,
ahead.
yeah. Hi, Chief. Thank you for talking to us.
Thank you.
My question is based on the school. For our community, we are really concerned that our children are being taught the CRT and LGBTQ agenda. I know you are against the CRT, which is a relief for us, okay? But my question is, how are you going to stop the CRT and LGBT agenda being taught to our children? As far as I am concerned, I think 1/3 a book is LGBT folks for our children, and another third is CRT based. So how are you going to stop it?
And I appreciate that. And what a great question. There are a few barriers in the state that I'm aware of. I guess there's a school board that the governor can't control at the state level.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I plan to do is create a parent-teacher advisory council and use my bully pulpit to bring awareness to Michiganders. I can do that. More importantly, though, we have got to change the narrative. You may or may not be aware that recently, in recent weeks, the Democratic Party put out a statement basically suggesting that parents don't get to dictate what students are taught, society does. And then they take it down. You know why they took it down?
Yeah, because we actually, I was one of them also shared on the media, say, hey, this is what the Democratic Party is about.
Right. So I'm about school choice. I'm also about supporting the stakeholders in school. The stakeholders in school are the parents. The schools must be student focused, not special interests, not school boards, not unions, first and foremost. So part of what I would do as governor is certainly embrace school choice, because I know school choice is going to do what? School choice is going to make those underperforming public schools competitive. In addition to that, I'm going to hold school superintendents, school boards, using my bully pulpit, because as it stands right now, the governor can't, but voters can hold these folks that they put in office accountable. But if individuals know that parents, because I think one of the most appalling things that was said by the Democratic Party, they said, you know, if parents don't like, if they don't like what's going on in public schools, go ahead and pay your money and go to a private and send your children to private school. What they missed out on, and this is tragic, we're taxpayers. And those schools, those public schools are funded by what? The state. So I will tell you, in addition to driving competition and holding these public schools accountable, why does the state fund underperforming schools? Not on my watch. Now, if the school is underperforming because they're not properly funded, we can talk about that. We can look at that. And if funding is an issue, we want to make sure that underperforming schools are funded. But if we fund underperforming schools because that's the issue, the expectation is simple. You're going to be held accountable because our children will be able to read by the time they're in third grade. Because, and I didn't say this in my opening remarks, so we were talking about that plant that opened up in Detroit, 30 years. Here's what was mind-boggling to me. So the mayor wanted to hire 3,000 Detroiters. Detroit public schools are failing. In today's automobile manufacturing industry, you have to take an exam. If you can't read, you can't get hired. When I went to work in the plant, there was no exam. Fortunately, I could read because I was going to engineering school while I was working in the plant at night before I became a police officer. So those schools can be held accountable. And oh, by the way, the other thing, look, the unions are not going to support me. I'm unapologetic. I want our children to read. I want them to be literate. And I'm going to fight vigorously for that. We need to, because this is about the future of our state. And I'm committed to it. It's going to happen. And if we don't make this happen, the future of Michigan is trouble. I'm just going to tell you. Yeah. It's trouble. Because not every student graduating from 12th grade wants to go to college, but we certainly want them to pursue other skilled trades that they can certainly get training from. If they want to work in a factory, a good paying job, why not? So I hope I answers your question.
Yeah. Can I add another question?
Sure.
What do you think about the mask and the vaccine mandate in our schools for our children?
Thank you for that question. I don't like anything mandated. I like freedom. I embrace freedom. And, you know, and more importantly than the freedom, what does the science say? You know, these decisions, when you look at what's going on in a lot of these cities, a lot of these states, and now I just heard today that some of the blue states are backing off of the mandates. Our governor here in Michigan, I think I might have mentioned in my opening remarks, 3 or 4 weeks ago, she says, I'm against vaccine mandates. A week or two ago, she says, I support President Biden's mandates. So what is it, Governor Whitmer? What is it? Are we following political science or are we following real science? Look, I'm not a scientist, but one thing I would do is so very different. I will follow this. If the science says X, I'm going to sit down to the folks who are most impacted, Look at what happened to our businesses. We shut down restaurants. We shut down barbershops. We shut down gyms. And now there was a recent report that said what? We don't need to wear masks. Our children don't need to wear masks. Look at what's happening in Flint. Flint has shut down schools, I'm going to use their words, indefinitely. And remember, I gave you those statistics about literacy, and only 10% can read by the time they're in the 3rd grade, and you're going to shut down schools indefinitely, and the governor doesn't say a word? Shameful.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah, she only followed the polls. That's what it is.
Right.
And it's like also rules for vote, not for me.
Bruce
You know,
Lee
many
and not for
times.
me.
Yeah.
Right.
And when you become governor, please investigate why she got a private planes to Florida. That's a corruption to me. Please. All right. Next question, I think from Cindy, please.
Cindy.
Yeah, let me turn on my video. Hi,
How you doing,
hi,
Cindy?
Chief. Hi, Chief
how you
Craig.
doing?
Nice
How
to
you
meet
doing?
you.
Nice
And
to meet
I'm-
you too.
Yeah, I'm really happy to hear your speech tonight. I cannot agree more with most of your opinions. I can say for now, yeah, nothing I disagree so far. So thank you. Because of time, I want to keep my question really simple. Since the year 2020, you know, the election fraud thing really impact my confidence as a voter. So my question to you is like, what do you think you can do to help to rebuild voters' confidence in our election process, especially for Michigan? Is any way to audit and clean up the QVF, the qualified voter file? So I read something on the SOS webpage that there's a qualified voter file. How do we audit, make sure the information is correct?
Right. So let me start out, and I mentioned in my opening remarks, my mom, you know, taught me as a young man and my siblings the importance of the vote. My mother served many, many years as a poll worker. She believed in the right to vote. And so throughout my adult life, I voted. And I know it had a lot to do with my mom's influence. Voter integrity is critically important for me, critically. You know, I've said publicly that there should have been a forensic audit to find out what occurred. Unfortunately, there's been no real evidence to say whether the election was stolen, but what I do know, there are a lot of folks that are concerned about election integrity. And
Right.
so the one thing I don't want to see happen, I don't want to see folks say, well, I have no confidence in the election, so I'm just not going to vote. What I do hope and what I do support at the very minimum is voter ID, critically important. You know, I always tell this story. Just after I retired as chief in Detroit, I voted in the most recent mayoral election. I walk into the poll workers saw me, Chief Craig, we miss you, we love you. And they said, I need to see your ID. And I gave them my ID very proudly. I thanked them for asking for my ID. And I know that the Republican lawmakers are really vigorously pursuing that voter ID should be mandated. Are we familiar with what's going on in the great city of New York? Right now, they're saying, you know what, if you're in our country illegally, you can vote. Shameful, shameful. And that mayor supported it. New mayor, former police officer, shameful. That's not constitutional. It's illegal. And God forbid, I will never let that happen in the state of Michigan. Never.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So, Chief, it passed 9 o'clock, but still a lot of people have questions. So, if you don't mind, we continue.
Yeah, we can continue. How much longer you want to go? I know we're a little bit over. I probably talked too long, didn't I?
You're great. You're great. Thank you. So next question come from Michelle.
Michelle, Michelle.
Hi, Chief. My name is
Hey.
Michelle. Thanks for spending your time with us tonight.
Thank
I have
you.
a short question for you.
Yes.
How do you plan to win over voters in the city of Detroit, where overwhelming majority of the voters there voted for Democrats?
You know, Rand, I got to tell you, that's a beautiful question. And I love, you know, what's interesting, wherever I go across the state of Michigan, that question always gets asked. And here's a bit of good news. So, you know, as chief of police in Detroit for 8 years, nobody ever asked me, well, are you Republican? Are you Democrat? What are you? They never asked me. When I applied for the job and I was appointed as chief, no one ever asked me. They wanted to know one thing. Are you going to keep us safe? Are you going to work to support us? And as a longtime public servant, I demonstrated that time and time again. Detroiters are not going to forget that. I've had so many Detroiters come to me and say, look, I'm a lifelong Democrat, but Chief Craig, I love you. I love what you did for the city of Detroit. I trust you. You're transparent. Unlike our current governor, who has not always revealed the truth about things that are going on, you have never been afraid to do that. You've taken responsibility. You've made changes. And so part of my message to Detroiters, especially African Americans, that support me, vote for me. And many of them come to me and said, look, I'm no Republican, but I'm voting for you. My dad, as I indicated in my earlier remarks, my dad and mom, lifelong Democrats. My dad said, you know, son, I voted for a Republican governor twice. And I said, why'd you do that? He said, well, I did it because I believed in that governor. I believed in what he could do for our state, and I voted for him. So I believe we have an opportunity that at least no other GOP candidate that's in the running right now can do, but I can. We've seen what other GOP candidates could not do, but I can. I am absolutely convinced we can do it. We can do something historic in Detroit and in Wayne County. I believe it. And even though I haven't conducted my own poll, but because I meet a lot of Detroiters every single day, and they tell me, I'm voting for you. I respect you, I trust you, and you're going to get it done. So thank you for the question, Rand.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Thank
Chief,
you
I
very much.
remember-
Thanks for the answer.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I remember when you announced your candidacy, was it on BLL? The Antifa BLM activists really just stormed, try to intimidate you, try to harass you. You can tell that's the fear. And I think they know what's coming.
Yes, absolutely. And what's interesting, Gary, is the BLM, they're loud, but they do not represent the majority of folks that live and work and are entertained in our city. They're loudmouths and they represent nobody. And so I'm gonna have to contend with them. But I do think what was most sad about it, we knew they were coming. We contacted the state and we said, are you gonna have law enforcement present so that we cannot have any problems, that we cannot be disrupted? And guess what? The state let me down. And I understand it now. But as a law enforcement professional, I don't care what party you align with. I often tell this story when Rashida Tlaib, who I didn't agree with her on anything, when she was threatened, I made sure the Detroit Police Department gave special attention to her residents because that was the appropriate and professional thing to do.
It's integrity.
Right.
Yeah. So Chief, I got a question actually myself for you regarding the equal opportunity for everybody. You know, we're immigrant community. We came from China mostly, and we came here inspired by Dr. King's, you know, I had a dream, you know, we should be judged by our characters, not by skin color. But however, you can see it in the recent years with the so-called DEI, the equity, the study equality. That's two different things, okay? Equity is really communism, in my opinion. It means doesn't matter what, right? And it should have an equal outcome. It's actually discouraging the American dream because Asian American communities are actually achieving the American dream in the best way you can imagine, working hard, personal endeavor, care about the community, same time, you know, that's being the best and do their best so it can have a better contributor to the society. However, now we heard like not just the white privilege, but also like Asian privilege. That's just bull, right? So what's your take on that? Because my opinion is like this kind of a trend, even we heard things like math is racist, you know, STEM is racist, is actually pulling everybody down instead of pulling everybody up. It's really just putting America in a competitive disadvantage and actually hurting African Americans, Hispanics as well. Not just, it's not helping them, right? Looking historically, if you watch the movie Hidden Figures, see what African Americans were doing in the 60s and how, you know, hard they're working to get where they need to be. And by doing this, we're not giving them opportunity. Actually, it's racist, in my opinion. It's telling African Americans are not good enough. That's racist.
That's
so,
racist.
So what's your take on that?
You know what, Gary, great question. As an African American, I understand one thing and one thing only. And this was something that was instilled to me early as a young man growing up by my parents. Work hard, study hard. I believe in merit. First and foremost, merit. So let's think about President Biden, which he recently said, I am going to make an African-American woman, I'm going to make history and make an African-American woman a Supreme Court justice. Bad. Look, I'm all about African-American. I'm African-American. But so what do you say to the rest of the populace? What do you say to others who are equally qualified? You shut the door on them. Let me just say this. I know no one's ever given me anything. I also know I had to work hard, study hard, and I knew I was competing against myself. I mentioned earlier in my opening remarks, first African-American chief in Portland, Maine. Portland, Maine's 99% Caucasian. They didn't select me because I was Black. They select me because I was the best. And I'm not saying that from a place of arrogance. I knew I had to be the best. Cincinnati, it might have been 47. Kansas, they had never had a Black police chief in Cincinnati. I competed, frankly, I competed against some folks that were assistant chiefs and chiefs in much larger cities than the city I was a chief in Portland. I competed and they gave me that position, not because I was Black, because I was best qualified. Likewise in Detroit. I talked about building effective teams. What's interesting, as the chief of police in Detroit, I promoted more women to high-level positions in the Detroit Police Department than any of my predecessors. In fact, one of my predecessors was the first female chief. She was African-American in Detroit. Those women that I promoted to first assistant chief, to assistant chiefs, deputy chiefs, command level officers, they got it because of who they were. They got it based on merit. Now, let me peel back the onion a little further. I also think it's important that when you're in an executive seat, that you create opportunities for everyone so that they can compete. As a minority who came up in my profession, I know full well many times minorities, African Americans, didn't always get the opportunity to work in coveted positions that will prepare them for advancement. The key to advancement is very difficult, that if you have two candidates, one has worked in a diversity of jobs, the other one has only worked in one or two places. So if you're just looking at merit and the most qualified, the person who was given the opportunity to work a lot of different jobs certainly is going to be what? More qualified. So as a leader, it's important for me, and I've done this in the departments I've worked, create an opportunity that people get the right experience so that they can compete. And when they compete, a selection will be based on merit.
Absolutely. Thank you. At the same time, I understand, as a society, we need to provide vertical mobility and, have some, kind of preference to underprivileged people. Doesn't matter what race it is, because there are white people in West Virginia living in real misery. And there are Asian Americans living in Detroit and they live in New York City and in LA doing like 3 jobs. So by putting them as a privileged situation and discriminate against is racist, right? Just the Supreme Court right now is taking the lawsuit against Harvard. I hope they will rule correctly. They will uphold the justice for this country. So appreciate the answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So,
any other questions, please? Okay. So I guess we'll get into the closing time, right? So any closing remarks, Chief Craig?
Well, first of all, again, Gary, and to the conservative Chinese Americans, again, happy year of the tiger. And I just want to say I'm humbled and I'm honored. I hope that you support my candidacy as your next governor for the state of Michigan. One thing that you may know about me, I am what I am. I say what I say and I do what I do. I'm not a person that has been a politician, a career politician. I am not that. But what I am, I'm a public servant who truly believes in the importance of serving people. And that's what's most important to me. I had a good career, 44 years. I could have probably been, I would have loved to stay the chief 10 more years. I could have sat back and complained about the things that we see going on, both at our national and state level. But I didn't want to do that. I've always been a person that, one, will take risk, but want to be about meaningful change. So that's where I'm at. I support you. I look for your support. And so again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Chief Craig. Yeah, I also put Chief Craig's website to the chat window, and we can donate.
And also, I would like to say, if I can say one last thing, there are a lot of people, because I was talking, a lot of people were saying nice things, sending messages over to Zoom. To all of you, thank you, and I got you.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you.
Go
Thank
get
Thank
it.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, good night.
Okay,
Thank
good
you.
night.
Have a good night.
Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Nice to meet you.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.